Thank you. Yes, so this is our last panel of the of our time at the festival. So we're going to be discussing the question: are we on the brink of change? And Lucy will be chairing the panel. But let me just firstly introduce you to the panel members. Professor Peter Kinderman is Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Liverpool, studying the psychological and social determinants of mental health. He is a practicing clinical psychologist, clinical advisor at Public Health England, and former president of the British Psychological Society. He is author of various journal articles and book chapters, as well as a prescription for psychiatry, new laws of psychology, and a manifesto for mental health. He has received many research grants and acts as a clinical advisor for Public Health England. So, welcome, Peter. Next, we have Hári Sewell. I hope I'm saying your name right, Hári. Okay. Hári is a writer and speaker in his specialist area of social justice, equality, race and culture and mental health. Hári is Honorary Senior Visiting Fellow at the University of Central Lancashire and Specialist Guest Lecturer at University of Bradford, Visiting Lecturer at Christ Church, Canterbury University, and is a member of the Scientific Board of the ESRC, Centre for Society and Mental Health. Hári is a proud member of the Board of Trustees at the British Association of Social Workers. Welcome, Hári. We have James Barnes. James is a psychotherapist, lecturer and writer with a background in post-Freudian psychoanalysis and philosophy. His core interests are in relational intersubjective models of the psyche and the demedicalization of emotional and psychological distress. He has a psychotherapy practice in Exeter in the UK and works with clients remotely. He is currently writing a book on the relational psyche for Confer Books. Welcome, James. And we have Rebecca Donaldson. Rebecca is a confessional poet and a doctoral student in positive developmental psychology at Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. Her research interests include adverse childhood experiences, narrative identity, and exploring ways to support individuals with histories of complex trauma. Rebecca writes and performs poetry about the harm frequently done by the mental health system to adults and histories of childhood trauma. She detests the label of borderline personality disorder and argues that dialectical behavioural therapy is inappropriate for survivors of childhood abuse and neglect. Her first collection of poems, Mad Women, was published this year. Welcome, Rebecca. Thank you. And of course me, I'm here too.
Thank you for introducing everyone, Akima. So a little time now to think about, are we on the brink of change? So Bob Whittaker says, yes, we are. So that's good. We may or may not agree, but if we are, then I hope the UK is, to some extent leading the way in this, and AD4E doing its bit. So I've got some questions that the audience has submitted, but I thought I'd start just by going round. I'll probably go around in the order in which I can see you on my screen and ask you just your brief initial thoughts. Are we on the brink of change? And just before I do that, I just wanted to summarise some of the themes that I've heard emerging so far today, which are to do with it doesn't really work to kind of tinker with systems, according to some of our speakers. We need something more fundamental than that. We need a very different way of thinking. More connected. We can't really talk about changing the mental health system without talking about other kinds of important changes. Really the complete failure of the current paradigm, but we've also heard that almost nobody in the general public knows about it. And we've also heard how we need love, rage, connection, attention to trauma, hope, courage, challenge, and activism. So that's kind of where we've got so far. But are we on the brink of change? I'm going to go to you next, Peter, because you're next on my screen. What do you think?
I hope so, but there are forces working against that change. So I think quite a lot of us in, I suppose, the communities that have been critical of traditional approaches to psychiatry have been talking about the conceptual models. And like Bob was talking about, we've been talking about the disease model, defeat depression campaign, serotonin, and other sort of monoamine neurotransmitter theories of mental health. And I think Bob's right. I think those stories have run into the ground. I think we've had a genetic approach. The reason why this person is depressed is because there is something wrong with their serotonin, then there's something wrong with their genetics. And we've had those models. And I think those of us who've been critical of that approach are hopeful, because we say, look, the curtain's being drawn back on the magic wizard in Wizard of Oz. We see that there's no evidence for those models. Therefore, the system will change. My fear is that I might have been fooled here as well, which is I'm not sure that the edifice is actually built on those models. I think in some ways, the Defeat Depression campaign, the marketing around the drugs that correct, of course, non-existent chemical imbalances, the focus on genetics, in a sense, is academic and scientific cover for blame the person. Don't change the system, hand it over to the medics because they'll deal with the detritus of society, wash our hands of social responsibility, let them get on with it. If they want to come up with a conceptual model that covers their asses, then they can. Meanwhile, we'll just ignore the needs of the most vulnerable people in society. And if I'm right, then I've been fooled, because I think that when the disease model is shown to have no scientific value, people will somehow go, right, well, we'll have a humanistic model, a model based on social justice and the provision of social benefits to people in most need. With this current government, I'm not sure that that's true. And, apologies to friends coming in from America, but Joe Biden isn't exactly a socialist, right? So, commercial healthcare companies giving us the bare minimum that right-wing governments will think we're entitled to of our own money, of course. Yeah, it's always been backed up by a disease model, but I'm worried that instead of saying, oh, look, the conceptual model for psychiatry for the last 50 or 60 years has no scientific validity, therefore we'll switch to a humanistic model based on social justice. I'm not sure that's true. I think they'll go, oh, well, fair enough. We're still not going to give people the services that they need. And if it's the case that we'll fall back on some sort of right-wing ideology that you're just weak, you just don't have enough resilience, bad luck, then we'll fall back on that as a model. So I think that maybe what we've done is maybe we've been successful in the rather pointless exercise of winning the scientific argument. And what we now need is community activism to do the real stuff.
It's an interesting thought, which kind of brings up the question of, as you say, if the scientific narrative has changed, does the emperor just continue prancing around with no clothes? And if not, do we end up, what do we replace it with? That's a big question. Do we replace it with something as bad or worse?
Well, and my GP colleagues, when I speak to genuinely my friends, I meet them in the school playground and they're GPs, what they do is they do the best they can. They're not resilient proponents of a disease model of psychiatry. They're giving people Prozac because what the hell else can they do? So, so they're not warriors.
They could not give people Prozac is what else they could do. But anyway, thank you, Peter. Next on my screen is Rebecca. Welcome, Rebecca. What are your thoughts?
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. I think it's a really big question to answer. I think that depending on the place that you're at and where you're working and what if you're in developmental psychology, I think we're often looking at the harm that's happening in systems. But if you're in clinical psychology, it's a different narrative that's being told. And so I think it's a really big question to answer. And I really think we need to come together when it comes to developmental psychology, clinical psychology, all these different fields really do need to come together and discuss what's going on. I think there's a lot of activism going on at the grassroots level. There's Facebook groups like Drop the Disorder. I have a Facebook group, Stop Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. There's lots of people talking about this. However, it's a really big question, and we have to think about, what do we need for a paradigm shift? Is it that we have to wait until this old way of thinking dies off, or can we start doing it now? We have to really think about what do we need for that paradigm shift, I think.
Thank you. And I think paradigm shift, it's an overused term, isn't it? I think it is appropriate here because that's actually what we're talking about, isn't it? We're saying, I think we need it, but I think we're saying how near are we? Can we actually achieve it? Thank you, Rebecca. Akima, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have loads of.
Your presentation is the answer. We have the answer. Thank you, Akima.
But there's something about, you know, how far is that brink? You know, brink could be, you know, miles away, or it could be just at that point, you know. And I guess for me, patriarchy, neoliberalism, capitalism, it doesn't give up easily. It's a machine that's been trugging for a long time, and you know, and certainly it's been, you know, psychiatry, mental health is one of those state institutions that's been used to legitimize state interventions. It was used to legitimize slavery. It's been used to legitimize, you know, incarcerating women and loading disorders onto women in terms of who were talking out about their experiences of violence. So there's something else that it serves as a function. So even if we do dismiss the scientific rationale, I've got no thoughts that it would ever, a social justice model, I mean, that would be, I don't know, I'm going to grow 6 foot ears and be called Yoda. It's just not going to happen because of what the mechanism to keep people in a place, in a particular place. So it's not about individuals thriving. This whole system works on, you know, a minority, a majority population being minoritized. So I guess I'm a bit more pessimistic about it. I'm hopeful that we have intention and purpose and are driven to do something about it. That's why I ended mine with a call to action. You know, we can't put up with this. But I've got that pessimism about, but it's going to take a lot to overturn and to turn it. And also those roots and who's invested in what. People don't give up power easily. So it's going to take that. Who's going to give up their places and their positioning of superiority?
I think those are really, really important points, Akima. We take the diagnostic model away. What do we find? We find it serving an awful lot of purposes, and there's a lot of power interest behind it, which is one reason to suspect it's not going to just crumble just when we say, oh, look, it's not scientific. Thank you. James, you're next on my screen. What are your thoughts?
Firstly, honor and a privilege. Thank you for inviting me. I agree with what's been said so far. I think to Peter's point, you know, what's happened with the arguments and the scientific evidence has led a lot of people to redefining disease and redefining disorder to accommodate that. So it's kind of, they move the goalposts. So as an intellectual thing, it's you know, it's a real challenge. And I think to Akima's point as well, once you start unraveling it, picking it apart, you end up with the structure, the whole structures that are there, the power structures of patriarchy, capitalism, but also individualism, right? That we seem to be on an inexorable path towards further individualism if we go on the path we currently are on. And that's such a big theme that goes far beyond psychiatry and mental health that it becomes a huge ask and a huge movement that's required. Having said that, I think the experience I've had, I guess a lot of us have had recently with the Joanna Moncrief and Mark Horowitz paper, and the amount of attention that got. I know one person we know in the media was saying that he'd never seen a mental health story take off like the chemical imbalance study by Joanna and Mark. And an article later that came up by Sana called I'm a Psychologist, and I believe we've been told devastating lies about mental health. I noticed that too, got a huge amount of traction and attention. And to me, that said something I hadn't experienced before as well. The way those both took off, that there's something brewing, I think. So I am optimistic about that. But again, to both of your points, to all three of your points, I'm under no illusions that what this is pointing to is something huge. It's the structure of our society itself in the West, particularly in the UK and the US. So I guess I'm kind of mixed on that. The one thing I would like to say is I would just like to give a plug for psychotherapy, and that psychotherapy is gaining more sort of respect and authority, let's say, vis-a-vis psychiatry, and that most psychotherapy models are non-medical, and they're very person-centered, and they have a totally different vision, really, of what's going on. And I see that in some teaching, that there's an enthusiasm there too, for saying, like, what the hell's been going on here? This is the wrong way to do it, and there's a different way to do it. So I see some good signs there too.
Thank you. I mean, I've been around saying the same things for a very, very long time, like several of us. I also have a sense that something's brewing. It does feel different to me. You know, you bang your head against a wall for many, many years, decades in my case, and it does feel a bit different. And I also recognise that, but there's a hell of a lot we're faced with. And so, Hári, what would you like to say in response to some of this stuff?
Thank you. Real honor to be here. So I guess there's a statement that emerged in a dialogue with a colleague following the Black Lives Matter uprisings in 2020. And we kind of concluded that to the privileged, the conversation feels like progress. But of course, to those for whose lives are impinged by the adversity, it doesn't feel quite the same. So my conceptualization of where we're at is, yeah, we're on the cusp of change, but the change isn't about services yet. It's within the movement that we're in. The change is now moving from just the dialogue and the discourse to something around action. The more we move into activism collectively, we can then look for a transformation of the system, if you believe in the transformation model. And I think one of the kind of key features of significant change over centuries is when I guess the buffer between those voices, like in activist movements, and those with privilege becomes eroded. So, you know, psychiatry as a discipline and the mental health field has often acted as a buffer between politicians and the activist voice by reframing, reconceptualizing the disease model, and being that source of knowledge and expertise. And where there was a large degree of consensus in the professional movements, then, you know, politicians could speak to professionals and get a pretty consistent story. What we're now finding is that storyline is being fragmented because more and more professionals who had a vested interest in maintaining a biomedical model are now beginning to see, well, actually, the evidence base doesn't really support what we're doing. So because that's fractured, the path between the activist voice and the political voices is no longer being mediated by that buffering effect of the professional voice. And that's why I think we're on the cusp of change within the movement.
Well, I hope we are. Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, I guess that raises, well, for me, that raises the question of how quickly can we, I mean, I have some questions that I'll pose to the panel from the audience, but I just wanted to comment that for me, that poses the question of how quickly can we get in with what Bob described as a new narrative. He said we need a new narrative. It sounds like we're all saying that. And the risk as I see it is because the diagnostic narrative is serving so many power interests and purposes, there's going to be a huge move to kind of leap in with something that looks a bit different, but isn't that different. You know, it's like, oh, we have the biopsychosocial stuff now. Or, oh, we, you know, may not be serotonin, but it's bound to be something else. And let's throw another $1 billion or so down the drain finding it. Do we think that's a risk? Or what do we think about that?
Yeah, I think the, oh, we've got biopsychosocial, oh, we've always been biopsychosocial is, I think we've seen that a lot. My biased, of course, analysis of that is what you see is, you know, if we say diagnoses have no validity, or the chemical imbalance trope is clearly not only not true but false, the response from the traditional approach is we've always been biopsychosocial, we are now biopsychosocial, therefore you should carry on taking your meds. It's exactly the same. So in a sense, what they've got, if you see it this way, sorry, I'm falling into oppositional politics, but they have a fallback position, which is we'll carry on doing what suits us and our profession and our political overlords. We did have the chemical imbalance trope, and we did have genetics to explain it. Those have gone away. We'll use biopsychosocial and multidisciplinary teams as our cover.
Yeah. And we're always being told, aren't we, Peter, that we mustn't be oppositional and polarizing and contrary, and
We're always being told that.
we're always being told that, but do we perhaps have to be oppositional? I mean, is there any way, as we're so often told, of us all playing nicely together, when actually what we seem to be all be saying is there are really important vested power interests involved here, and it all be sorted out nicely? What do you think? If it's, I mean, either just wave or put that little hand thing up if you've got a comment you want to make. Yes, Hári, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in this point because it's sometimes it sounds simplistic to say, oh yeah, it's because there are vested interests, and of course, our economic systems and power will all shape this debate. I'm a real fan of analogies that sometimes kind of help, and I won't take up too much time, but I always kind of have this idea of if you had someone who was a millionaire who had made their money of renovating old buildings, and now they had personal staff in their chalets and all these places that they had to kind of protect. But the unfortunate thing is, because they were renovating new buildings, their staff were contracting asbestosis. Now, they might discover over time that it wasn't just that they were working in chilly conditions. They'd find that actually they can identify the root cause, but that's where they've made their money from. So they might introduce health insurance and all kinds of mechanisms to say, look, I'm really looking after my staff to make sure that they don't face detriment. But if you say, wow, you actually need to shut down your business because it's causing harm, they'll just glaze over because they couldn't even conceptualize that this is a reasonable debate. And then they'll frame it, well, I've got staff and I've got people to look after. You're going to harm the very people that you're trying to help. And I think that's where we're at with this debate, is that the vested interests are so deep rooted that I think it's hard to penetrate that. And I don't think people are just being obtuse intentionally. I think they literally cannot conceptualize that the models upon which the whole system is built are fundamentally flawed. So that's where I'm at, which means it needs radical action to break through that. Asking won't do it.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I tend to agree, and I tend to think it both needs radical action and it needs a different way of thinking, because unless you can see it in the first place, you won't even be inspired to action, and you'll end up replicating the same system. But I mean, I personally think that's true. The change, what we've exposed is a change that's so fundamental that it's actually quite scary and overwhelming in a way. It's a little bit like talking about climate change as we were earlier. We're exposing failure of the entire system based on exploiting the earth and its peoples and its species. And I mean, I don't want to make us feel too depressed, but what do we think about that? What do we do with that? We've gone from challenging diagnosis to changing, a whole way of thinking that actually dominates a larger part of the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what comes along with that as well is, to acknowledge that there's something fundamentally wrong with the models and the very fundamental basis and structure it is very threatening to senses of self and our sense of self. And there's something very terrifying about it for everyone, I think, what that would really mean. And I think particularly it would mean admitting to the reality of a lot of pain and suffering and damage that's been done, that it's kind of impossible to escape from. To accept what the model is also to accept that something profoundly damaging has happened, and there's some need for grief and reparation. That's actually a very difficult thing to admit into oneself.
Yeah.
One of the things that has been really disappointing for me in my career, I was very close. I shouldn't name her because it's rude of me, but I became quite close professionally to Labour MP, and spent some time talking to Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party about these things. What was interesting was that I think he sort of got it. So I think his style of, like the cat, James, cats play. His style of thinking about things was people break the law, partly because the law is designed in order to oppress people, but there's also civilized behavior, and people go off the rails mainly for social reasons. People go off the rails economically for social reasons. People become addicted to substances for social reasons, and people become depressed and crazy for social reasons. That's quite a Jeremy Corbyn sort of thing. It's never been the Labour Party policy. The Labour Party policy is fund the NHS properly. Well, what do we do about mental health? Well, mental health should be properly funded. because the NHS should be properly funded. What we need to do is properly support the NHS. So it's basically the Labour Party's position in the UK, of course, I'm talking from the UK, has always been a sort of traditionalist approach. Fund the systems that are currently there. There hasn't been this radical change. But I suppose what we're talking about here is something a bit more radical even than that. So we're not talking about, if we get what we want in the way of a different way of thinking about mental health, we'll get a really well-funded NHS. We might have a really well-funded NHS, but we would also have a whole different approach to understanding and caring for people who are in a great deal of distress and causing problems for both themselves and other people. And that means that there might be some conceptual links between Black Lives Matter, critical psychiatry, feminism, and social justice, anti-colonialism. I mean, these are all arrangements that say the fundamental basis of capitalism could be re-questioned. What you consider to be a legal personality. Why does Shell have a legal personality? It's one way of thinking about the world. And actually, you know what? This was born in the Dutch East India Company, and there are reasons to be skeptical of creating legal personalities for companies that allow them to exploit the natural environment and so forth. So maybe the future isn't, I'm sorry about this because I've spent a lot of my career doing it, looking at the validity and reliability of psychiatric diagnoses and the scientific basis of, genetic theories of psychiatry. Maybe that's not the future. Maybe the future is about a broad, radical social justice alliance that incorporates a reformed understanding of psychiatry under a wider social justice umbrella. And maybe people like me need to be a little bit humble and join in with the struggle rather than to persuade people of my argument.
Well, maybe it's both. I think it sounds to me like we're saying it's both, that as soon as you pull back the diagnostic narrative, you see the huge need for social justice, and you could approach that dilemma at either or both ends, can't you? Rebecca, yes, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I have a real problem with the way that we frame individuals' development over time. I mean, we're talking about them as if like bio is always the first thing that comes in the description, biosocial model. It's like, why are we talking about bio as the first thing that's going on with these individuals? Even when I look at Marsha Linehan's work, we're always talking about this individual as having a biological something within a system. We don't talk about the system first. When we look at Uri Bronfenbrenner's work on ecological theory, people develop over time and that relationship is bidirectional, and there's systems around that individual that are developing them. Yet we never talk about these things first. It's always this individual that has something going on biologically within a system, rather than flipping it and talking about the systems first and how those systems bidirectionally are shaping that individual.
That's certainly true. And I actually wanted to come back to something James said a minute ago. James was saying that psychotherapy of some sorts presumably can be a way forward. And I suggest, Rebecca, that's something you wouldn't necessarily agree with, at least if psychotherapy includes things like DBT, if we call that psychotherapy. What do you think about that?
Can you say that again, Lucy? I missed that.
Yes, I was saying, James a short while ago was saying that psychotherapy can be one of the ways forward, which maybe it can be, but I guessed that you might want to say something about not all forms of psychotherapy. And I know that you feel personally that DBT is not a helpful psychotherapeutic way forward. Would that be right?
I agree with James. I think that there's a lot of benefit from psychotherapy if you get the right type of psychotherapy. I think that personally, I find dialectical behavioral therapy punitive often. It's often judgmental, the way that we're approaching working with this population. I don't think that DBT has looked at, if you want to say BPD is even a disorder, there's 9 criteria, yet DBT doesn't address even 4 of them. So I have a real concern with the fact that we're applying this behavioral modification to people with severe levels of trauma. I have never met an individual with BPD who hasn't, with a label of BPD, who hasn't, had a history of trauma, and to approach it from just a suicidal ideation issue, I think that's a real concern. But I don't have any problem with, I think psychotherapy is great. I think things like internal family systems can be really helpful for individuals. And I think there is a way forward there. I just think that we need to think about what's helping people and what's not, and bringing people with histories of lived experiences to the table and asking them whether or not this is helpful. If it is, why is it helpful? If it isn't, why isn't it helpful?
Mhm.
I've still got that. I've still got. I hate to be the one who does this, but I've still got that skepticism, you know, because
Go on. This is what we're here for.
how we might tinker around with this piece when actually we need to bring the whole thing down. You know, we think abolitionism. What would that do in terms of, in order to create something that doesn't exist, then we need to make sure that we're bringing everything down, you know, something, you know, absolutely. As a psychotherapist, of course, I have a vested interest in that being a useful pathway, but only one of the pathways towards somebody's healing. But we have to also contextualize that. Psychotherapy has been used to discriminate against, you know, the lesbian and gay community. You know, I think that was only recognised, you know, queer politics was only recognised, you know, about a decade ago. So there's something as well about how we understand all of those systems joined together to create that level of oppression. You know, that, you know, psychotherapy isn't immune. You know, is it attending to, you know, Black lives, and is it reflective of experiences of violence against and oppression? Is that at the heart of it? When we talk about, you know, it's very insular, it's very much about the individual and not about the state. So there's still something for us and a long way to go, and it is about how we reflecting, you know, not just Eurocentric models but wider models. And also there is that skepticism for me. You know, I'm getting on, so I've been through the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and here I am again at the brink of something new. I'm not sure what that newness is going to be about. You know, there's something about our will and intention. What is the will and what is the intention? It's still about, you know, systems of power, and how are we going to address the need for power? How does that get dislodged? You know, I still don't think we've got that sense and the motivation. What is the motivation for people to be willing to move from their places of power?
It's interesting, because I think what we seem to be saying, among other things, is that, and I agree with this, is that therapy can be as individualizing and as oppressive as diagnosis and diagnostic. And I think that's absolutely true. It comes back to power. Again, there's one way of looking at it, isn't it? In whose interest is it served? And, you know, how do we frame the therapy? How do we frame the problems it's supposed to be dealing with? What's the relationship between the person who's meant to be helping, the person who's meant to be being helped, all that kind of stuff. None of these are simple answers, are they?
Just like to quickly respond. Totally take both your points, and absolutely. There's always this paradox that I often talk about, and when I've been teaching, I've been talking about it, exactly this, of the, I come from a very kind of relational basis, a relational model, where it's always about the dyad, about two people, about groups, about social functioning. But nevertheless, if you're doing psychotherapy, you're doing it with an individual, and it is a dyad rather than a society. And there's something that's self-fulfilling and self-individualizing about therapy. And there's that paradox there that leads me out to precisely where you're talking about. And per your point, Rebecca, too, the systems thinking, right? I mean, if you have a relational model, then you can't not think of systems, and how it has to be. I guess there's gradations, individuals, groups, families, but society. And in some sense, all of them need to be addressed, I think. And perhaps the individual is the least important. And if we are dealing with the individual with psychotherapy, I think there are certainly models that I'm skeptical of that are much more individualizing and locating of the problem in the person than others.
Yeah, we're talking about CBT, aren't we? But not just CBT. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if I can just kind of extend that, I kind of think one of the critical issues is the fragmentation. So we kind of talk about the individualization of the model, but actually the fragmentation of self into these kind of, the mind kind of starting with the Cartesian dualism, but even this kind of separation from the external world is highly problematic. So we end up with interventions that are always going to be partial because they're built on, it's like market fragmentation of the human being. And actually what we need to do is to see holism as it was, that kind of connection with lifestyle, the environment, and the different systems within the body. Because if we achieved that holistic in its purest sense approach, we wouldn't have interventions that we believe would fix a problem. If it was just kind of, a single point of entry, we'd be saying, well, how does this relate to all of the other needs as part of the entire system of that person? Of course, in my language, I'm not thinking of that person in the very Eurocentric, individualistic sense. I'm thinking of, indigenous communities who think of the person as being actually connected to many others. There's no sense of an individual I, that whole connection. So I kind of think fundamentally our problem is that we've got the fragmentation of people.
I do.
Just a little.
Yeah, and Peter is a bit of a CBT fan, I know, so he may
Well,
want
I'm just going to tell an anti-CBT story. So, yeah, but this is part of my CBT fan, but it's a politics story. It's also, I'm white male, middle class, well connected, blah blah. So I was on a Boxing Day walk with a guy a few years ago. Happened to be.
You're going to name drop. You're going to name drop. Peter.
No, I'm not going to name him because he's a member of my family. But he was running Job Centre Plus, right? So we know about Job Centre Plus. And he goes, so tell me, Peter. He goes, CBT, does it work? So I said, yeah, it does. It works very well. And he goes, right. So if we offer them, he meant claimants, a course of CBT, and at the end of it, they claim that they're still depressed, they're malingering, right? That's a form of fraud. So you've got everything. You've got the personalization, you've got CBT as a cure, you've got the fact that the system is using it, and you've got the idea that the person at the end of it who's still saying, actually, I'm still depressed. Do you know why? Because my wife died. No, you're actually a malingering fraud, depriving us taxpayers of our benefits because you've had the treatment and it no longer works. Now, when I said it doesn't work that way, he goes, okay, fair enough. But that was his way of thinking.
Well, that's scary. And if ever there's an ideologically driven project, it's IAPT, increasing access to psychological therapies, isn't it? Which is basically the problem I have with your story, Peter, is when your initial response was, yes, it works. I mean, I would dispute that, and so would some other people, but depends what you mean.
Meet me halfway, okay?
But so we're saying that it's, it's not unproblematically true to say that therapy can be helpful. Of course it can, of course it can't, but it depends a lot on the way it's framed, and therapy itself is framed. It emerges from a particular Western tradition based on all sorts of assumptions like separation from each other, from the natural world, hence the climate change crisis and so on, which need to be challenged. And I've had a couple of questions from the audience about other possible ways forward, which I'd like to just try out on you, but I suspect we may end up saying the same kind of it depends kind of thing. So one question is, would it help, or is it necessary to bring some kind of legal case, let's say against drug companies or against doctors? And as some of you may know, there is a legal case almost certainly going to be taken forward against health authorities, I think, for damage caused by ECT. And I suspect that if and when that happens, and if it's successful, it will bring about a big change, at least in the use of ECT, if only because health authorities in the UK are going to be at risk of being fined vast amounts of money. So is legal action one possible way forward? What do people think?
It might be a good idea for people, if they're feeling brave enough, to have a scout through their psychiatric notes and to see if chemical imbalance is written down. I'm sure it's been said, but if anybody could find it in writing, that might be quite useful. I think lots and lots of people have been persuaded to take chemicals on the basis of a lie. Now, the chemicals might have been helpful. A lot of it, I've got tea here, it's got caffeine in it, and chemicals can be helpful. But if we have been told to take chemicals on the basis of the chemical imbalance lie, I think that would be useful. Have a look, see if it's in your notes. If it is, I think there's a case there, and I think pretty good. Actually, that would be a damn good thing to do.
Interesting. I mean, I personally think when other things don't speak, money speaks. The threat of a legal case could bring about some changes quite rapidly, not necessarily the changes we need. And another question about somebody who's exploring the use of psychedelics. This is the new big thing in psychiatry, as I'm sure you've seen, and it's kind of interesting to me because implicit but not stated in all these glowing articles about people's lives transformed by psychedelics is a shift to a trauma model, because actually this is justified in terms of under the influence of these drugs. Well, they have some kind of nonsense about connections in the brain and loosened up, etc. And then you resolve your traumas. So are psychedelics the way forward? A way forward? Could they be part of the answer? What do people think?
I don't want to dominate this conversation, but I have close colleagues who work in the psychedelics field, and some of the psychologists working there are both active and keen and like the idea of psychedelics. They do very interesting things to the brain for people who've taken them recreationally or for sort of spiritual or personal development reasons. They absolutely do things. The thing is, what we can see overtly is the pathologization and the medicalization of the psychedelic industry. So what you've got is people starting to develop psychedelics for working with people who have serious psychological problems. And it started off with ayahuasca, magic mushrooms, carvings on Neolithic art, a huge tradition of the spiritual and life-affirming consequence of taking psychedelic chemicals into this is a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. So it's becoming commercialized and it's being dragged away from it. And now you have for ketamine, for instance, you have clinics, and it is rapidly moving towards the idea that instead of you having therapy facilitated by psychedelic drugs, what you do is you turn up, you get your shot of the drug that cures your illness, and you go away again. And it's profoundly depressing to some of the psychologists who are working in that field.
And I guess there's something as well about we always want to change the human condition. Why do we want to do that? Why do we want to run away from it? Why do we want to take mushrooms or take medication because somebody's heartbroken because they've experienced violence, or they're heartbroken because they've lost their partner? You know, there's something about we shouldn't keep trying to insulate, trying to change that energy. There's something about a natural process. And you know, I think all of these things, what they're doing is creating those limitations. They're giving us a time limit, they're giving us something that's outside of ourselves to process, as opposed to us being absolutely naturally to process. And then I also think, well, all things are equal as well. So there's something as well. If that gets somebody through, if that means that actually their levels of distress and despair in some ways are held, that they need that holding, then absolutely, why not? But it's not going to be one size fits all. How do we nuance everything to that individual need is something. How do we support individuals to have a range of ways that they can engage, whether that's with CBT, whether that's, DBT, well, they all got these acronyms, but anyway, or psychotherapy or magic, there isn't going to be that one size. So there's something about, a freedom and a choice, but still the fundamental thing, how do we stay with supporting individuals to process and let go of their feelings?
It's staying with pain, isn't it? This theme's come up already about our inability, our difficulty, our resistance to staying with pain. Yeah.
And there's something really quite deeply ironic about the psychedelic space as it is now, and that in some important way, a lot of the struggles that we have in this society and US society is to do with isolation, fragmentation, per Hári's point, right? And from the perspective of the kind of times and cultures that the psychedelic ritual uses of psychedelics came from, that's kind of the issue in some way. It's an important part of the issue, what's happened to our sense of self. But then the psychedelic use, as the medical use, as Peter's saying, it's alone in a medical room. There's people there supporting it, but it's a hugely individualistic affair, right? And it's completely isolated from somebody's social context. There's something quite strange about that. And the kind of therapy that's offered at the moment is usually ACT, which there's some good things about that, but the way it's set up is that, you have this experience and then you integrate it afterwards. You integrate it into yourself, into your narrative. you know, and there's something valuable about that, but it's a very sort of discrete, circumscribed experience where you're taken out of, completely extricated from your context, which in some important sense was the problem in the first place. So it kind of feeds that similar sort of cycles in that way, I think.
I do think that's very true. And I think also the idea of taking these drugs in the first place has been taken out of its context, isn't it? Because I assume when they're used in the culture within which this emerged, there's a whole setting and set of beliefs and assumptions and rituals.
Yeah.
We've pinched a bit of it and tried to medicalize and individualize it, which is very characteristic of what we do, isn't it?
Thoroughly.
And I think fundamentally we're still caught in this idea that we have some interventions that can fix something. And I quite like the idea of us framing everything, either individual interventions or even our activism in these spaces, that will be engaging in these interventions or dialogues in the meantime, whilst we still try and, I don't know, change the architecture. That anything we do in someone's life or in this movement we're in should just be seen as part of something that holds rather than fixes. And again, my analogy would be, I remember the first time I had a puncture and the guy at the garage just said, you can put this foam in, it'll get you home. But as soon as you can, you need to go and get your tire sorted out. That's what we can do in the movements, and we can kind of get there, but it's never going to be a permanent fix. We just need to kind of go back and work out how we're conceptualizing the whole issue. And my final point on this is, we're still seeing this work as separate to society, that you have this idea of psychiatry or mental health as if it's not the same as all of the climate activism, you know, ableism, anti-racism, you know, feminism, that the whole works is still part and parcel of this.
I think that's true. And I'd like to, my personal request to take us the next step down the road would be to ban the term mental health. I mean, what the hell does that mean? We never used to think we all had mental health, did we? We thought we had feelings. We were upset, we were distressed, we were lonely, we were bored, we were fed up, we were pissed off at times, and we still are. We call it a mental health problem. And it's an immediately cutting yourself off from the context of your feelings, the context of your lives. You know, I think it's actually become quite a sinister, I don't think anyone's doing this deliberately, but a kind of sinister kind of rhetorical strategy, which is just as bad as mental illness, in some ways worse because it's so pervasive. We're all meant to talk about our mental health problems permanently and constantly, which, you know, which immediately decontextualizes them. So excuse my little rant, but that you know, I'm a bit obsessed by language, as some of you know, but I wanted to mention something rather interesting and exciting, which is there are some very important developments in psychiatry that I heard about in a conference I was at only last week, where a leading clinician who'd been working in all around the world and produced some rather depressing figures about how everybody in these particular countries was depressed and all the rest of it, had set up a trial which involved, you may have heard of this, putting benches in the middle of villages where, in rural places in India and various parts of Africa, where grandmothers often could come and sit and offer to come and talk to people. Now, what seemed extraordinary to me was not that I disputed the value of this. It's very much along the lines of the things that I think Matt was talking about earlier today, about kind of ordinary people supporting each other. But this was being touted as a psychiatric intervention, which seemed to me quite extraordinary. So you apparently need to train for kind of 95 years to become a doctor to then go and say, why don't we put a bench in this village? And that's something very important, I think, about, you know, what I think we're all saying, the fragmentation of our societies, which is at the root of all this, and the simple human measures that actually we can start to take in order to heal that.
Right.
How does that go down with the panel? Make sense? And could this be part of, you know, I'd quite like to think about, in order to drop one narrative, you certainly need to have one to replace it. This is what I found working in services for many years. People find it very hard to drop the diagnostic narrative unless you could persuade them that, you know, another of my obsessions, formulation does the job better. And then once they've experienced that, then it's not such a battle to drop diagnosis. If we're setting a fundamentally new narrative, we do need to outline at least the principles of what a new one would look like.
Yeah, Hári mentioned the puncture analogy, and it is a little bit, maybe a different analogy, it's a little bit like cleaning mold from around your shower, which is if you don't get rid of all of it, it comes back. And here you got this, right? So look, I'd love to be unoppositional, and Joe Moncrief is a psychiatrist, right? Actually, genuinely, my best friend used to be a psychiatrist. I'd love to hug him, right? But the mold creeps back. So if what happens is that we go, got it, shouldn't be oppositional, we're all there, it's all part of the same big family, and yep, you're right, we're all biopsychosocial. What? Benches are part of the psychiatric establishment's intervention plan. No, I think this is the creep back of the mold. Sorry, but it makes me a bit angry, because you've got these individualizing, dehumanizing, you've got a problem and this is the treatment for your problem. Message is creeping back into the narrative. So I love the idea of benches for grannies, but I don't like the idea of the individualizing, dehumanizing, pathologizing narrative creeping back into the dialogue. So yeah, maybe I'm going to carry on with the mold exclusion policy for a little bit longer.
But that's the risk. It's the co-option risk, isn't it? That genuinely helpful things. This is part of what we're saying has happened about psychedelic drugs, isn't it? Things that might be genuinely helpful, particularly in context, and make a lot of sense, being co-opted. But nevertheless, something there, I think, about connection and human healing, human listening to each other's stories. Yeah. Would that be a fair thing to say? That is perhaps, part of the new narrative that needs to get established?
What's kind of striking is if you kind of go back to 1978, the World Health Organization report that kind of looked at the recovery rates from prescribing psychiatric drugs and the kind of variations looking at India, Colombia, and Nigeria, and comparing those societies to the global north. And one of the arguments that clinicians would use to explain why there are differences in recovery rates in countries where there were lower levels of prescribing was actually it wouldn't work here because they have different models of society, and that's why they could kind of different family connections, different dynamics. And I'm really interested into the subtext, and the subtext of that kind of response is, well, actually, they've got different models of society which seem to kind of hold and support people through their mental health problems. But it would be too challenging for us to think about trying to change the nature of our society. So we'll just go for prescribing instead. That's actually the theme of that. And it tells us quite a lot about we're happy for people to pay the price of that because the work of trying to support a restructuring of society is too hard. That's why I'm kind of so keen on thinking about how we structure society globally, by the way, not just in this country.
Absolutely.
And it reminds me a lot of some of the situation I've seen with open dialogue, which is very much a model, although it's a clinical model, but it's a model that was developed to structure a whole service, right? That as it was originally in Lapland, it structured the whole service, but it's kind of being brought into a type of intervention by psychiatry, a psychiatric intervention, when the people who came up with open dialogue were kind of specifically distancing it from psychiatry, but including them within it as a possible option, and it's that way of kind of, I think my point here being that, along with what you're saying, Hári, that there's an existential threat here to psychiatry, right, as the medical discipline. I think that they know, or at least some know, that there's a baselessness to it, but they're not willing, they can't go the extra step of saying things like we're talking about aren't medical, because that would kind of mean the end of the medical appropriation of suffering. So there's an existential quality there, threat quality to it too. And I think that's something that makes me slightly pessimistic seeing that happening.
Yeah, I think I just want to say this isn't about psychiatrists as such. We have some fab psychiatrists associated with AD4E, as you know, and it is fundamentally, in my view, about a way of thinking which has infected all our minds like a virus. So exemplified by some psychiatrists, but it goes far beyond that. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm thinking about how to kind of summarize what I think it's quite difficult to summarize what we're saying, actually, and maybe that's characteristic of the situation we're in, that we are, I think, I mean, it sounds like we all agree that we are at least more than we have been for many decades, possibly on the brink of change. It's not clear how quickly that can happen. There seem to be huge obstacles. The way forward isn't very clear either. But it sounds like that, you know, there is some reason for optimism, as well as a good deal of feeling daunted about the scale of the task, because when you draw back the veil of the diagnostic narrative, my God, what you see is a lot of, you know, very powerful interests and really fundamental assumptions about ourselves, our relationships, our societies, the way we run our world, the way we see ourselves as human beings, the way we deal with suffering, which is what we're talking about. We're not talking about mental illnesses or mental health problems. I think we're talking about human suffering.
But let's also put ourselves in social context. We live in a political sphere. So if right at this moment Jeremy Corbyn were Prime Minister, I'd be really optimistic. I could imagine a whole swathe of civil servants and junior ministers going, right, great, how can we mobilise the agencies of the state to help the most vulnerable in society? If Keir Starmer were Prime Minister, I voted for both of them, by the way. There's a thing in the Labour Party. I voted for Jeremy Corbyn and I voted for Keir Starmer. If Keir Starmer were Prime Minister, again, I would expect junior ministers to go, right, okay, social determinants, they, but for the grace of God, go I. Living conditions affect Robert Tressel, ragged trousered philanthropist, birth of the NHS. Got you, Peter. What are we going to do to help people? We've got, and I'm going to swear now, so put your fingers in your ears if you don't like it, we've got a fucking cow, Liz Truss, as Prime Minister. I don't have much hope for people embracing on a society-wide level a model of social justice. I mean, okay, I'll wait 18 months, then maybe things will change.
Okay. I mean, look what happened to Corbyn. You know, what happens when you really challenge power, you get thoroughly shafted, don't you? But I wonder if we could just, somebody in the chat is saying they don't think there's one narrative way forward, one new narrative. And I think that's probably true, but I wonder if we could just briefly go around as a way of finishing off and put forward perhaps our favourite element of the new narrative or narratives that are needed. And if I start, I mean, I would say my usual thing, I think, which is about changing our language. I think that's so important. Our language shapes our thinking, the way we think changes how we act, and it limits the ways that we can even start to think differently. But I'm going to go around in a circle. I'll go around the other way to the way I started about an hour ago. One thing, one ingredient of a possible way forward, Hári, that would be important to you?
I think decoloniality and challenging patriarchy, because those two things relate to gender nonconformity, relates to ableism, relates to the fact that we see human beings mainly as these microsystems of production. If we go into those two, then I think we start to shift the entire narrative of everything we do.
Just a small ask. Decolonization and dismantling the patriarchy. Just a small ask. Thank you. James, you're next on my screen.
I'm going to say this because it's what I'm most interested in, but the increasing turn and focus on social ontologies, right, on our concepts of what's going on, de-individualizing them and moving to a much more social sense of reality.
Thank you, James.
The thing that's different about a Virgo holiday home, you always have the whole place to yourself. Just you and your people. Because why would you ever share your holiday home with someone you wouldn't share your holiday with?
I don't know what that is. Can a tech person deal with it?
It was, I think I've muted it, yeah. It was John.
Okay, what's John doing? Okay. He's even worse at tech than I am, which is saying something. Okay, Akima, your thoughts?
Yeah, that kind of put me off. But anyway, yeah, what can I say? Yeah, smash the patriarchy. You know, it's a beginning and an end, and you know, does so much damage. But also, I think we need to deal with ourselves and think about will and think about power and what the incentives are to let go of power. So that's also at the heart of it, and about oppositions. We was never meant to be in opposition. How do we have things about harmonising? And always for me will be about revolutionary love. It's going to squeeze out. Will squeeze out the nastiness, of course.
Revolutionary love. Thank you. I like that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I like the revolutionary lab too. I think we need to start focusing a little bit more on peer relationships, community building, really looking. I think there's too much emphasis on individual healing. I think we send people off to do ayahuasca and really focus on themselves. And I like what James said about it taking yourself away from the context. I think we really need to look around and focus on healing in a community, flow experiences, helping people find meaning in their life right here where they're at, rather than having them go around and try to figure out who they are. I think we need to look at each other and build community together.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, in some contrast to my overreaching anger earlier, I think there's some practical things we could do. So one of the things that we could persuade health authorities and social services to do is to use the existing internationally recognized codes for real experiences, both personal experiences like anger, guilt, low mood, hearing voices. They're all internationally recognized good taxonomies of people's real experiences and social determinants. The World Health Organization list of social determinants that they're designed to be entered into the computer systems that all countries use for their healthcare delivery includes insufficient welfare payments by the state. It includes violence by domestic partner. It includes sexual trauma as a child. We could record these things and just simply drop the diagnostic language and use those. I'm sure our managers would complain because they quite like the diagnostic codes, but they exist. Very few people use them. We should use them more.
Thank you. And we've had some other suggestions in the chat as we've been going through. I didn't have time to pick them all up, but we're not short of ideas. And this conversation today is all part of a change as well. It's part of sharing ideas. It's part of building a new narrative. So thank you so much for being part of this panel. And thank you very much to our panelists.